Right, Dr. Jean-Pierre de la Porte, who probably is known to the audience since you seem to be a bunch of students, have made his acquaintance, but just to formalize the introduction, he is a philosopher and writer, and he, in particular, interest obviously with architects and architecture since 1986, when he was introduced to the Wit School of Architecture by Professor Pancho Guedes, and he may predate most of you, but Professor Pancho Guedes is one of the legendary personalities of architecture in this country. He acts as advisor to various government initiatives, particularly with departments at national and provincial level. He's research director at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Architecture and Infrastructure, and he's also director of the CIC, which is a major public-private community partnership in the creative industries. He's Gauteng-based, has been, with the Messiah Palmer. He has curated the SA Pavilion at the 2014 Venice Biennale, which has kept him busy in the latter part of this year. We are very happy to have Jean-Pierre with us this evening. Jean-Pierre has a very lucid and what I would say non-obfuscatory approach, particularly to architecture, and I always enjoy him telling us as it is, and I hope you're going to have one of those tonight. First time I heard Jean-Pierre was actually the student congress here. Was at the time, I think, Krishna Duplessis, now acts as research director across the world. There was Eloise Loach, who is now in Australia. Whatever the bright young things who set in motion this particular student congress, and Jean-Pierre was invited as one of the speakers. And the one thing that has stuck in my imagination is Jean-Pierre spoke of, I'm sure it was architects as fish or architectural theoreticians as fish, and Jean-Pierre said there were fish. There were fish, and there were angel fish.
You said thank you for that very kind.
Thanks,
It's always a great pleasure to be with you, Roger, and you, Rudolph. Thank you very much for the invitation. And to all of you for coming out tonight, what is obviously the middle of the heat wave. My topic may reflect some kind of euphoria because around that Rorschach blot on the poster, very nice, I offered to speak about the relation between architecture and philosophy as two framework disciplines, and I made it more difficult for myself by saying ultimate framework disciplines. I hope to be able in this time, and our time is what, 1 hour. Please give me some birdie noises, or fish noises, okay, when it gets 10 minutes to the hour. Thank you. And I hope in this time to be able to unpack and cash in some of the claims involved in the notion of an ultimate framework discipline. And also to look at some of the uneasy rapport between architecture and philosophy since they, in the 20th century, came to occupy the role or become contenders for ultimate framework disciplines for us in Western traditions. And to show why at the top where the ultimate frameworks are, there's very little room at the top. You know, the cowboy notion of this town's not big enough for the both of us. It actually becomes quite true of the relations right now between philosophy and architecture. But hopefully we will conclude on that. How many of you are coming from an architecture background and how many of you are coming from a philosophy background? None of you are coming from either, that's very interesting. You're architects, not philosophers. Philosophers all got fired for supporting Dan Roth. Okay. Then we'll make it very simple. We'll only be criticized by the philosophers on YouTube, the podcast. I'm sure they'll be muttering their beards and having one of those moments. Philosophy is a kind of small, patch-up, busy little butler, maid, servant in the big castle type discipline for a long period of its existence in the West. And today it's a sort of academic ghettoization, reflects that long history of, not insignificant, but of, let's say, derived significance. By derived significance, I mean in the European Middle Ages, philosophy would have been doing tidy up work or concept lending to theology. It would have tried to have cleaned up the various conceptions of ultimate moral authority. And during the early period of naturalization in the human self-conception, the early modern period, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the time we associate with Galileo, or Leonardo's beautiful diagrams and so on, philosophy also plays an ancillary role. It plays a tidy-up role to a naturalistic, to a science-based conception of reality and of ourselves. The kind of tidy-up philosopher in the religious context would be somebody like Thomas Aquinas. The kind of tidy-up philosopher in the naturalistic scientific context would be somebody like René Descartes. So philosophy could have easily remained the bridesmaid and never the bride, and always simply provided method, hints, support after the fact, to broader moral endeavors such as religion, or to broader epistemological or knowledge endeavors such as the natural sciences and the increasing naturalization of our conception of ourselves. I'm saying this to point out that in neither case would the impartial Martian observer regard philosophy as an ultimate foundational or framework discipline for much of its history. It was kind of that little punk in the back of the selfie, and you say, oh, he was also there, you know. But the big action is never particular around philosophy. Where things change dramatically, and this is a little intricate, but please feel free to just pop out questions if there's anything you don't understand, you're not comfortable with. Where things change for philosophy and where it really makes a bid for the first time to be a framework discipline, to be foundational to something else and maybe everything else, is in one figure. And that is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who for many people is associated with Enlightenment philosophy and with modern philosophy. Kant was early modern philosophy, but the agenda of modern philosophy, and to some extent the agenda of contemporary philosophy, is set by Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant's innovation, or let's say his centrality to philosophy today, come inside where we are. Big bad wolf, blow the door down, eat the pigs. Philosophy's centrality, Kant's centrality to philosophy today, which is really a kind of dominance for 200 or more years. Remember, Kant is contemporary with the French Revolution. He's adult outlook, he's mature outlooks, contemporary with French Revolution. So he's kind of spanning that era. 1789, he's contemporary with Goethe, roughly. And yet, this old figure, if you had to think of another figure that old, you would think of Christopher Wren, or you would think of perhaps Joseph Haydn, the composer. These are Kant's contemporaries, and yet Kant is so central. He managed to become so fundamental to any consideration of philosophy, to the doing of philosophy, that today, an understanding of Kant or the study of Kant still serves as the kind of distinction between students of philosophy and students of theory, sociologists, theorists, critics, etc., who deal with a lot of issues which seem philosophical, which seem to deal with reality and critique and so on. The difference between those who deal with these matters as philosophers and those who deal with these matters as any other kind of intellectual, as intellectuals, or as theory academics, really turns around the acquaintance with Kant. He still remains the touchstone of what makes or certifies or legitimizes a philosopher today. In a sense, it's almost inconceivable to do philosophy or to grasp the project of modern philosophy without a thorough understanding of what Kant attempted to do and what indeed he did achieve. And throughout the intervening period, there are almost continuous restatements, if you like, of either Kant's problems or restatements of Kant's solutions. This will define philosophical modernity. The most obvious restatement of Kantian solutions is Hegel's. The most recent restatement of Kantian solutions is the linguistic term, analytic philosophy. Philosophies of symbolic forms like Kazire and so on and so forth. Kant haunts the philosophical imagination. Michel Foucault was substantially obsessed with Kant, wrote many commentaries on Kant, wrote his subsidiary doctoral dissertation on Kant. And Kant runs like a sort of motif throughout the pages of Foucault, particularly his masterwork, The Order of Things. So Kant is a strange, haunting figure, and I'm laboring this in order to show you how strange a disciplined philosophy really is. Because you cannot imagine a contemporary composer or Brian Eno walking in here saying, the most important thing that gives me the credential to be me as a musician, as a producer, is my understanding of Joseph Haydn. You know, Kant's contemporary. So you say, well, okay, Haydn was a great composer, but why would he have this dominance and endurance and this centrality? You know, for all this time, surely a lot else has happened. Surely there's been some sort of supersession. Something's newer. It would be like an architect walking in 150 years and saying to you, Corbusier defines architecture. Corbusier defines the architectural endeavor. Without understanding Corbusier, you are not really an architect. You are a critic, you are something else. But the real meat and potatoes, the nitty-gritty, the separating of the sheep and the goats, whatever you like, really lies with Corbusier. But in fact, that's the situation with philosophy. Now, I want you to be as surprised at this as I am, because Kant really does occupy a hegemony, if you like, or a franchise over philosophy, such that if you have not understood what Kant was proposing, and of course Kant, genius that he was, nevertheless could not roll out his entire philosophical project. He envisaged what philosophy should be, and he attempted to fill in that space with his three major books, each one called The Critique of Pure Reason, The Critique of Practical Reason, and The Critique of Judgment, or more literally, it's called The Critique of the Powers of Judgment. Right? And they deal respectively with three things. He's trying to fulfill his own program. It's like somebody says, we must have spaghetti bolognese, and then goes up to the kitchen to prepare spaghetti bolognese. So he prepares three books that set out to demonstrate what he thinks philosophy legitimately is. And the one concerns itself with what we may know objectively, so the limits and the content and the form of what we as humans may know. It sets out to answer the question, what can I know? The Critique of Practical Reason sets out to answer the question of what can we do? What are we able to do and still justify? In other words, what are our possible rational actions. And the third book sets out to say, what is judgment itself? What is the form or the structure of accountability? And surprisingly enough, that book deals with two things, aesthetics and organic form. Be that as it may. What comes out of this strange mix is a philosophical program that takes philosophy out of its Cinderella status as something that helps tidy up religion, politics, as in Plato, or science, but turns it into an absolute foundation. The foundation, the discipline that answers the question, what can we know, including what can science know? Not what does science know today or yesterday, but what can the sciences possibly claim to know? What can we possibly claim to form judgments about, not just art, but what is the power and the extent of judgment as a capacity, as a power we have? And what can we possibly do? What are the boundaries of our action? What can we do or undertake as humans? Revolution, make history, shape ourselves, whatever, and still be able to call ourselves or account for ourselves rationally, be able to give reasons. And in these three critiques, Kant provides the philosophical foundation for politics and the understanding of history, philosophical foundation for art and the understanding of processes, such as that involve wholes, totalities, teleologies, and he provides the philosophical underpinning for our understanding of science. Science should then look to this in order to see whether in fact it is rational or fruitless in its lines of inquiry. We should look to this to see whether we are rational or fruitless in our lines of action. What kind of government should we have? What kind of state should we have? What kind of rights possess validity? What kind of obligations do we have? What is a social contract? All of these things should be answered by philosophy in a book like The Critique of Practical Reason. These are all matters of practical reason, but none of them are the foundations of practical reason. Practical reason provides the foundations for that. And the same is true of, can we have a reliable knowledge of nature? Will we ever complete our quest for a knowledge of nature? What may we call objective? What is not objective? What is belief and what is knowledge? What is conjectural and what is valid and certain? All of these matters are no longer answered by saying, well, science has the answers, look at what the scientists do. Here it becomes a matter of philosophy has the answers. Let's look at Kant's book and see what we ought to do. And the same is true of this problem child in the middle. You'll notice I kind of jump around the middle. The critique of judgment really proposes aesthetics and all the issues of modern aesthetics, from taste to sublimity, to the art world, to whether Duchamp's urinal is there by convention or by some intrinsic property. Every issue you ever find in aesthetics, in some sense, comes to roost in Kant's critique, and in some sense is construed by him as a result of our ability to apply judgments to our judgments, to use judgments reflexively. I don't intend to go into this, you can Wikipedia it yourself. But the whole tangle, the whole flavor, if you like, of contemporary aesthetics, the flavor of contemporary political and jurisprudential thinking in the West, and the entire notion of epistemology, of a theory of knowledge, in particular a theory of objective knowledge, of scientific knowledge, of reliable knowledge, is laid out and set out by Kant. But now the amazing thing, either he's simply a megalomaniac, and everyone else doing these things has been too stupid to see that you can get all the answers in a little pot, or there is something very unusual in what he does. And indeed there is something very unusual in what Kant does. Because he's not like somebody who searches around culture and institutions and finds, like a hidden treasure. Here the answers have been, here the method has been all the time, the way Descartes might be. Here is the method, the rules for conducting scientific inquiry. Here is the aspect of ourselves, our nature, our perception, our behavior, that allows us to conduct inquiry and so on. It is not like that 18th century discussion. It is a very subtle displacement that Kant introduces into our thought. And it's this displacement that makes philosophy such a framework discipline. And that is, he says it's not what we know, or what we do, or what we experience, say, aesthetically, but it is the form of what we know, the form of what we do, and the form of what we experience that allows it to be a candidate for being either rational or being something we should not pursue, something which would be fruitless to pursue, because it's not rational. And rational is not like some little toothpick that you can pull out of your lapel and, probe into something and say it's rational or not. Rational is not a quality of the inquiry you're undertaking. Rational is a game that you are invited to play. And Kant shifts the entire game or the entire space of philosophy into what we would call technically modalities. He doesn't say this is about what you do when you're successful. He says this is what you ought to do. And what you ought to do allows you to justify what you have done rationally. You're dealing with ought. You're dealing with a space of possibilities. You're dealing with a space of obligations. That's why simple things like practical judgment, epistemological judgment, and aesthetic judgment simply bring these obligations into play. Kant says being rational is not to have some particular faculty that you could see light up on a brain scanner or whatever. Studying rats, how rational are rats. That is a completely wrong form of the question. It's a nonsensical form of the question. He says to be rational is to be accountable. He puts us all in the position of Oscar. Oscar, to what extent are you accountable for assassinating Reva in the bathroom? To what extent are you accountable? The entire trial turned around accountability, and the entire verdict turned around accountability. Kant says that unless you are prepared to give reasons, in other words, answer someone's questions about what you do, unless you're prepared to be accountable for the conduct of inquiry, you cannot call yourself a scientist or a knower. Unless you are prepared to be accountable for your social and civic actions, you cannot call them rational. And unless you are prepared to be accountable for your taste, you cannot call it an aesthetic judgment. So there's this game of accountability where any of you can challenge me to be accountable. It's very simple. You ask me a question. I give you an answer. I decide whether the question is worth answering. You decide whether the answer is a worthwhile answer to your question. You make me accountable again until you get what you want. I give you an answer until I think you have what you want. That process, in fact, is what Kant says philosophy is. It merely tidies up that process of accountability and says that that process of accountability is indispensable. In short, it makes you accountable to accountability. Now, of course, you can say, I don't wish to play that game. I don't wish to enter into that space of ought, where I ought to be able to give reasons for a belief in order to have a belief, for an action in order to call it an action, for a taste in order to call it a judgment. But if I don't, I'm becoming autistic. Yes, I can pursue my own idiosyncratic science, maybe even get a grant from the CSR. I can pursue my own idiosyncratic social agenda, maybe even get a homeland somewhere. I can pursue my own idiosyncratic tastes. I might enjoy kissing toes. But I realize that I can't account for it in terms which could advocate to you and make it something you would want to reasonably adopt and by reasonably adopted, be prepared yourselves to advocate it and to justify it. In other words, to answer anybody's questions when they question you about doing this. So I can bail out and say I'm quite prepared to have a negative kind of freedom where I'm not called to account for something, but then you will say, because you cannot account for this, it is not legitimate science, it is not legitimate aesthetic judgment, and it is not legitimate political or civic action. So I am free to be a hermit and pursue my idiosyncrasies. And in effect, the greatness and also something of the violence of Kant is that he says previous philosophy and previous theology, in fact, is that hermit. It cannot account. It thinks of things as having a substantive basis in reason, in God, in concepts, whatever. But it refuses to say accountability is what makes these things legitimate. And therefore it is a hermit-like, illegitimate, idiosyncratic walk activity, which he simply consigns to the dustbin of dead or illegitimate ideas, what one cannot account for, what one cannot put through a jurisprudential process, what one cannot establish and fine-tune through accountability. And really, I'm talking about the Oscar trial here. The Oscar trial is a slow motion of Kantian judgment. It is a perfect example of how judgment works and how accountability works. And accountability shapes our willingness to put ourselves behind, our consensus behind, a judgment as valid, as just, or as true. So Kant brings, if you like, a jurisprudential model, a trial model, to knowledge, to action, and to text. And so provides us with an ultimate framework. Ultimate in the sense that it is a disqualifying move to say, I refuse to give reasons when you call upon me to, and any of you may call upon me. It's part of my dignity as an inquirer that I grant you and recognize you as having the dignity of an inquirer equal to me, such that you may question me while I'm going about my business. And if I refuse to justify myself, then you quite legitimately can ignore. My claims and my activities become simply subrational. So it's not a framework in that it's very big. It's a framework in that it is an essential ingredient in any activity or anything humans do that wants to be legitimized as rational. Okay, is that all clear as mud to you? The reason why this is important is because the moment this little innovation of form, saying that rationality is not in us, it is in a game that we are invited to step into. And when we step into that game, we continue to be in the game as long as we're prepared to give reasons, to make inferences from what others say, give reasons and ask for reasons. But the moment we cease to seek justification of that form, we step right out the game, as if we walked out of a poker game. We have lost both our winnings and our losings. We are now not playing the game. So, in a sense, the ultimate framework does not exist in us. It does not exist in the world. It's not like stepping into a phone booth and getting superpowers like Superman, having a quick change of clothing and flying away to save the world. It does not exist in the world. It does not exist in society. It does not exist in you and me. It does not exist in rats' brains. It does not exist in philosophy books. It does not even exist in the disciplines, scientific, aesthetic, political, that philosophy concerns itself with. It exists in another space, in a kind of modernity. And like the rules of a game or any rules, once I enter that space, I'm dealing not with facts but with norms. I'm voluntarily compelling myself to submit to those norms. And the payoff for doing that is that I am then entitled to have my actions, my tastes, and my beliefs regarded as true, justifiable, or defensible, and rational. So it's like a tiny little ingredient. But without that ingredient, the loss is quite precipitous. You fall right off the edge of the game of reason giving, and hence the game of reasonableness. You fall outside of rationality in its modern interpretation. And so everybody sticks to the game. So that is a very cheap and nasty characterization of one ultimate framework, and how philosophy since Kant became a very prevalent ultimate framework of justification for everything we do, because it's a form which accompanies everything which we do, and it's an obligation which we undertake, but we also make others undertake, insofar as we question them and they question us, and we feel obliged to answer their questions or justify ourselves. If you write a book, you have a particular belief on something, much of your book is spelled in justification of your belief or your point of view of something. You have a set of documents and interpretation, you write a history or note of history, that much of the account is there to justify those facts. They are not self-justifying. Art is not self-justifying, facts are not self-justifying, and actions are not self-justifying. We need to step into an ancillary space, and it is the nature of this ancillary space which Kant maps and recognizes and takes us away from the idea that reason is either an endowment, something psychological we have because we're not animals or cats and dogs and whatever, or something which cats and dogs have, despite the fact that we think they don't. It's just not substantive. And nor is reason a kind of social style, a way of doing things. It's not a cultural endowment. It's not something which comes from a tradition. It's a game with rules. But of course these rules are continuously in play, because the rule applies only to the form, not to what goes on in that activity. And hence the longevity of Kant. Now, right. 638. Half and half. Now you may say, well, okay, Kant really snuck something in to Western self-understanding and created this normative rationality. And today, we don't want to even allow an institution to pop up in our society if it cannot also provide a justification or account for its recognition or its legitimacy in terms of a normative rationality. We're not happy with the EFF because we say it's maybe not a genuine political party, because it cannot fit within the normative rationality of Parliament. On the other hand, we are very happy with the EFF because we say that Parliament does not fit within normative rationality because it avoids certain questions. Either way, EFF or old guard, old school, you are raising the question of whether there is justification for the EFF's behavior or justification for the censoring of the EFF, because each institution is protecting a norm. So you're being absolutely Kantian in your approach. You're probably being quite Kantian in your dreams. When you see some beautiful vision in your dream, you say, I must get up and put it down on canvas, etc. But will it communicate? Or is this just some quirk of mine? You know, you're saying, in other words, can my taste be defended in terms of reason giving? My painting, my art itself is a form of reason giving for a sensation. What I'm saying to you is that you are dyed-in-the-wool Kantians, even though you may never have heard of Kant, which is probably quite an alarming situation, or a very happy situation. Because you Westerners can find out everything about what you are by just reading Kant, you know. He's your big daddy. Who's your daddy? Kant. Okay. It's an ultimate framework, but very much an intimate framework. It is to our lives what the rules are to games of chess or a game of football and so on. And many have expressed it, in fact, as a relationship between norms and rules. For instance, Ludwig Wittgenstein, recasting this Kantian insight that it is a form. Okay. Why would architecture even drift into this kind of orbit for discussion? Why should these two things even have anything remotely to do with one another? Most philosophers who try and make a living from philosophy, unlike Socrates or Kant or Wittgenstein, who listed himself in the phone book as an architect. Most philosophers think of it as just a set of norms, And indeed, you can see norms are very important in the Kantian picture, but they're just half the story. You have to bring the vitality of the situation to the norms, and you have to somehow ensure that the norm remains valid to the situation, appropriate to the situation. The norms have to function within a judgment in order to have some life. Otherwise, philosophy becomes a kind of necrophilic pursuit. But why would architecture sort of drift into some kind of relation with us? And our patrons, the kind sponsors of the series, are inviting us to stand here and interrogate this. What possible relation can architecture and philosophy have to one another? Because they really don't seem remotely similar. Yes, when you study architecture in the architecture schools, you seem to be given a bunch of norms, whether they're explicit or implicit norms. So it seems like the process of design, of decision-making, is sort of being brought under the kind of aegis of norms. But that is true of any academic discipline. Pedagogy is isolating something and giving it in its purely normative profile for the sake of teaching and examining it, for the sake of ranking your performances in relation to it. As individuals, you're a first-class norm follower and you're a zero-class norm follower. So it's not just architecture that gets powdered down into norms. The impact of Kant in the academy is to say that what is rational in pedagogy is its normativity. Hence talk of academic standards, judgments, exams, etc., which are in a way probes of the space of performances around norms. They're perfect examples of practical action in the Kantian sense. So it's not norms, actually, which makes architecture similar to this Kantian invention to the space of judgment. Because everything in the academy turns around norms. The academy's self-definition turns around norms. In fact, the academy's adoption of faculties is a little gift from Kant, in common sense. So, I mean, Kant is everywhere, okay? And let's make you into a conspiracy theorist and say all our modern thought is critique, because Kant is like breathed it. It's like Michelangelo's God and Adam and Eve. I'm giving you the CPR. I'm going to give you the breath of life. And this is normative rationality, the obligation to judge, to give reasons, and so on, everything which we've discussed. Well, architecture doesn't seem to be like that at all. First of all, architecture does not seem to concern itself with things, with actions, people, ideas, concepts. It seems to concern itself with things. And it seems to concern itself with things. I'm taking the liberty of saying space for this argument is a thing. It seems to concern itself with these things in one way. It concerns itself through design. It tries to conceive of and capture the properties of things, reconfigure them, explore them, etc. Not literally in things, the way a carpenter might do in making a particular series of boxes. Or somebody whittling ducks might whittle different variants on the duck and explore them through the activity of making. But architecture seems to explore things through design, and design itself seems to be facilitated by a slightly different space. Like the space of Kantian judgment, it is a space which is dependent upon possibility. It gathers an equal number of possibilities together. In contemporary terms, you would talk about a search space, but there is something sort of reminiscent about design space, where you've got a number of possibilities and a number of strategies for negotiating these possibilities in order to conceive of things, to shape things, to design things, to configure things, etc. But neither is it on that level, on that analogy between the Cartesian spaces in which you operate, the notations in which you operate, and the objects that these notations then inform or instruct or translate into, that the real relation between philosophy and architecture arise today, and indeed the rivalry or the displacement of architecture by philosophy and vice versa today. It is around this issue of ultimate framework. Architecture was far from an ultimate framework. At the time when people read Vitruvius and illustrated Vitruvius and sort of hawked the books around to those dumb Kim Kardashians of the Renaissance world known as the princes and the patrons, etc. You can sort of recycle, some Roman text on, civic spaces and put a few pictures in it, thanks to Albertian perspective, and you're ahead of the game. You get your own show on ETV. Gone are those days. Architecture in those days was still venerable. It was on the level of ingenious macaroni making or cake decorating or adornment of some kind, and it was quite close to a craft base. And it expended itself in a kind of necrophilic charm, trying to bring back the dead, bring back some kind of sense or resonance of the ancient world in order to legitimize itself, because it had a hard time legitimizing itself. It was pressured even in those days by engineering, by the mechanics, as Galileo called himself, the natural mechanics. And it wanted to find some kind of rather more cultural justification for itself, and it becomes a strange hybrid throughout the Renaissance, and in spite of itself produces some magnificent outcomes, but we're not really quite sure why, if we're being perfectly uncharitable about it. Architecture, in fact, remains a nothing. It remains what your dumb kid does. You make a lot of money. Your father was selling coal from a wheelbarrow to afford you to become a doctor or a lawyer, and then you want your son to be an architect. You give him a trust fund, and he becomes an architect. He's the crown prince, but he's what your dumb kid does. Okay? Your less dumb kid becomes a writer, or whatever, and maybe your most least dumb kid becomes a philosopher, and they're all academics, they're all professors somehow in this setup. So architecture is just like something that your most dumb trust fund kid could do, because they could sort of use their hands to get away with it. So what I'm saying to you is that it was not very illustrious, hardly a contender for this heavy-hitting role of a ultimate foundational discipline. But then we mentioned that philosophy in its Cinderella tidy-up operation, before Kant made it, if not central, but ubiquitous, was also just a rat and mouse activity that you could leave to the fairly dumb characters who would observe the laboratory, observe the kings, observe the princes, and sit in the art galleries. The tidy-uppers, the underlings, as Locke said, we are the underlings of science. Okay. So where does architecture go big? With Kant philosophy, go big or go home moment, is with critique. You're either critique and part of normative rationality, structured through critique, and the capacity for critique, or you're part of ancient fuddy-duddy metaphysics, which is where all the substantive reason goes to die. In architecture, you're either fantastic cake decorators, but a little bit redundant in relation to the tectonics provided to you by the engineers, etc., or the grand projects provided to you by the princes, certainly secondary to the money floating around in Europe. But you are not central to anything. You're also just kind of hanging around, wringing your hands, hoping for a bit of a gig, etc., trying to make it on YouTube of the day or whatever. How on earth does architecture, this modest discipline, as modest as philosophy once was, this ancillary discipline, how does it make a bid for the big picture? Well, it does so through a very strange sort of bifurcation that happens in the 19th century. We talk about the West here. Through a very strange bifurcation. The 19th century wants to conceive of humans in completely naturalistic terms. We are one with nature. Part of this endeavor is that we have to shape ourselves to be rational. We are one with nature and with the animals and the stars and the planets and the seas and the tides, but we therefore have the capacity to shape ourselves. We have a potential to shape ourselves into rationality, into humanity. And that is where normative rationality comes along. It's where a thinker like Hegel, who tells this great epic of self-shaping of humanity out of basically a natural condition, a thing-like condition comes along. But it's the fault of the 19th century to put ourselves in a thing-like condition as well. Now, it says, well, if we're in a thing-like condition, we who design and make things also shape things. Well, now it's becoming quite interesting. Do you as a human, a secular human, who doesn't believe you are shaped and programmed by a divine power, but you arrive here, presumably through natural forces, birds and bees and whatever, with a certain body, a certain endowment, a certain brain, but you have the potential, says Kant, through critique, through the use of yourself and of others, to shape yourself, to acquire a power of rationality and accountability. Good, well that's a kind of humanizing. But we also have the ability to shape things, particularly in the 19th century. We're designing all kinds of things and shaping all kinds of things. It's called industry, it's called civil engineering, it's called Brunel, it's called a complete megalomania of manufacturing. Never before have we shaped things and shaped our world to the extent to which we do it in the 19th century. But that belongs to design, industrial design, and architecture's playing catch-up with the civil engineers and bringing steel and glass and concrete and so on into the repertory. So why not just do philosophy, do normative rationality and shape ourselves into rational beings? We're elevating ourselves. And on the other hand, shape our world, shape things into something which is commodious, which is suitable for us, which we enjoy, etc. Well, the serpent in the garden, if you like, is the recognition that there are processes among things which shape themselves. And not only do things shape themselves, but they shape themselves rationally. And we are proof of the rational self-shaping of things, and that is the whole Darwin insight. That things have the power to shape, and not only to shape, but apparently to rationally select, albeit blindly. How do we have improvement without an improver? How do we have design, apparent design or adaptation without an adapter or a designer, etc.? The recognition that things are not inert for our will to be imposed on, but that in fact things, nature, is so dynamic that it shaped us, that it produces us, that we are derivatives of things. That is the very upsetting perception in the 19th century, and that is the avenue through which all the disciplines of design, through which all the disciplines of where architecture had sort of been and which permeated, get their bid for the mainstream. Well, I'm not saying Darwin came along from meditating on a mountain and had this idea. It is a confluence of a number of 19th century ideas that process might converge on something productive, and that rationality might be there without a rational agent, that design might be there without a designer, purpose might be there without an intention, and so on. The key notion which comes out of this perception that nature may shape itself, this 19th century perception. Once it's out the box, it's everywhere. If you read the 19th century literature, it's really a sea change. It is the equivalent of sort of Kant's ubiquity, the idea that nature may shape itself, that things may shape itself, and that things have the capacity for self-design. Evolution, the evolutionary processes from Darwin to Dawkins and beyond, are in fact the big thing. And the rage is not to understand ourselves in these terms. And the most important notion to come of that is an environment, because an environment is what does the shaping. We don't do the shaping. Genes don't choose. Genes are thrown into an environment which either facilitates them or eliminates them. Suddenly the environment becomes the active ingredient, this apparently passive thing. Nature, the environment, becomes the active ingredient in shaping things, all the way up to us. Hence we start conceiving of ourselves as being shapeable through environments. And not just conceiving ourselves as being shapeable through entering into a game where we try and acquire the means to shape ourselves, change our nature, change our actions, change our beliefs through a normative rationality. Suddenly an alternative means of shaping comes on the agenda, and apparently a much more solid one. because environments are very solid, and the ultimate environment is nature, the universe. If the environment has the power to shape through selection, then if we can produce environments which have certain powers of selection, if we can produce environments to order, then we may shape ourselves in them. At that point, philosophy, which had been the only resource of self-shaping, finds a competitor. Design. Design being nothing other than the attempt to design environments, and to design the power of environments to shape processes in them. It starts to enter into the space of Western rationality and the Western resources for self-shaping, displacing the humanism that had subtended that with the rather austere idea of a designable or fully designable environment. We go from being concerned with what's in our heads to being concerned with what our heads are in. And it's more effective if you want to change yourself, to change where your head is in, than to go through the age-old agonies of trying to change what is in your head. Hence the improvement of humans ceases to be a philosophical or humanistic or even particularly religious motif sometime towards the end of the 19th century. It becomes a matter for design. It's as simple as that. Shape the box you're in, and that box will create the kind of person, the kind of entity. Environments shape, therefore shape environments, and through environments shape us. Social engineering is not a form of normative rationality. Social engineering is a very advanced replacement for normative rationality, which we call Western reasonableness, we would call it Western morality, Western rights, Western judiciousness. We simply decide to replace that. And the great social engineering endeavors of the 20th century, there aren't that many, but they're all positively stunning in the good and bad sense in their effects. There is Soviet communism, which wants to shape the economic environment, and in doing so shape the whole of society and history. There is fascism, particularly the German variety, which wants to simply shape and reshape the biological constitution of the race and wants to breed and superbreed human in the right environment. There is the Roosevelt New Deal, which wants to make the market institution into the ultimate environment through which to reshape America and dial out the ills that have brought the recession. And then there is the South African social engineering, which is based purely on architecture and design. Build the right space, and you will have Western modernity and Western modern people popping up in it. And that project is perhaps the longest lasting and perhaps the most wide yielding of all the great social engineering. And they're all based upon the idea, don't control human nature, which was the philosophical humanistic frame, but control what human nature is in. And when you control what human nature is in, you're either designing an economy, you're designing a market institution, you're designing a new kind of biological, futuristic human, or you are designing Pretoria. So, there are the two ultimate frameworks. The power of things to shape things through the process of environment, selection, adaptation, random variation, gives us the power to design and shape environments. And we can even apply on a higher level the process of refining our designing and shaping of environments by applying to it these same selection criteria. We can talk about a design environment in which design happens, and so on. They can stack up at meta levels, but they remain essentially the manipulation of the container. The philosophical tradition, by contrast, wants to shape what is in you. It wants to take what is in you and productively deploy it for the purposes of objective judgment, a rational type of action, and a justifiable preference, justifiable taste. And so, we have two ultimate frameworks contending with one another. The design revolution essentially making humanism and normative rationality obsolete, and normative rationality fighting back, and basically construing the design attempt at human self-shaping through the environment, and shaping the design environment as brutal, as lacking genuine insight, as mechanical, as in some sense manipulative, etc., etc. And that is where the clash of ultimate frameworks is today. When Peter Sloterdijk writes very archly against Habermas, who's probably the biggest exponent of a Kantian tradition of the normative rationality, that in fact we should be thinking about rules for the human zoo. Because the politics and the managing of humans is like managing a zoo. A zoo is an environment in which you try and make each animal as capable as possible by putting them in the right enclosure. Okay? And then he's basically creating a kind of pit bull fight or a sudden death player between the design resource for self-shaping and the normative rational one. And from the one perspective, the other looks irrational. From the design perspective, normative rationality, deliberative democracy seems incredibly slow. Its transaction costs seem incredibly high. And from a normative rational perspective, the design revolution, where we fall, in that ultimate framework, seems extraordinarily simplifying, reductive, and brutal, and yet it yields effects. So I'm not sure whether our sponsors are hearing some kind of happy message of a harmonization between architecture and philosophy. I predict a far more intense war between architecture and philosophy, in which theory and ideas are like the poor underground runners who run sort of messages from one side to the other, the way we would in the old days of the Recycle Peace Talks, whatever, and try not to get shot in the process, because you've got two territories hell-bent on displacing one another. Because they're doing the same thing. They're protecting us from ourselves. And yet they're doing it in ways which are, to a large extent, incommensurable, share nothing in common, and they cannot absorb one another. Therefore, they cannot be the boss of one another. They endlessly displace one another in strange skirmishes. You would not think so, given the passivity, the happiness, the confidence of philosophy departments in universities, and given the industriousness, the practicality, and the humility of architecture schools. But in fact, we're dealing with the two biggest megalomaniacs in the West. So thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
Now, you've given, I think it was 4 consequences of the shaping of environment as a design,
Selection,
action. Yet I don't know if any one of them today can be seen as ultimately successful. I think it was part of the other debate as well, you know. Not one of them has brought us to a point where we can say, yes, that's the one that works, and discard the rest, or they still seem to be competing with each other in the world as we find it today. Do you have thoughts on that? Is it a healthy situation? Will something emerge? Will it be a compromise? Will there be a sifting out of the good and abandonment of the bad or failed?
Roger, I'm not optimistic about a working compromise between these two situations in which we find ourselves imbricated. Because they work along very different principles and involve very almost incompatible commitments. They both stem from the Western project of naturalizing humans, of seeing ourselves as part of nature rather than having some qualitatively extraneous origin or source. We are not exceptions within the universe, we're part of the universe. The Kantian project, the invitation to take up a normative rationality, from what I said, it's clear that Kant is not saying you're born with a normative rationality the way a rat is born with shrewdness, or an ability to sniff poison or whatever. You're not born with this, but you are born with the ability to take up a project, of behaving as if we have norms, can submit to norms, and can use norms almost as tools to give greater force, the force of rationality and legitimacy to our thoughts, our actions, our preferences, and so on. So it is a project that is to be taken up. And it's a project which is taken up in civil society, in politics, in deliberation, in criticism, in debate, in philosophy, certainly. Wherever norms are brought into dispute, we find new and ingenious ways of either eroding them or replacing them or turning them around or finding consequences of these norms which open further spaces for exploration, which become a further responsibility, a further something for us to justify. So this game of accountability on the one hand is played in society. Whereas the game of shaping the environment, the perception that the environment has the power to shape, and therefore if we can shape environments, we have the power to shape. The game of social engineering simply says your normative rationality is no more than a rationalization. You are actually being carried along as a natural being by the currents of the environment, the group, etc. you're in. You might think that your group, your political party, you sit down to critically discuss everything that's going on, in essays, critically discuss, evaluate, and give reasons for your answers. You sit down with this mantra, and you're doing this. Somebody, a social engineering perspective, would say, well, you're not critically evaluating anything, you're just creating a bigger and bigger bias, reinforcing the bias of the group by all showing up on Friday night and having a good moment, you're like a DA chapter meeting. So, effectively, from a sociological mechanism point of view, you are just rationalizing, you are not providing a rationality. So, it's as if the social engineering perspective undercuts where normative rationality thinks the rubber meets the road. Now, you would have to weigh up whether there is a chance for normative rationality to genuinely be a power of reason giving and consensus building, and whether we can build a free consensus and a rational society and bring our powers within our control and our answerability to one another, our social justice, into alignment through the invitation that Kant opens to us. And all the great thinkers after Kant, after Habermas, everybody really. Or whether that should be seen as futile. It's just a rationalization of what in fact is really carrying us along. And whether we should be suspicious, whether we should see under all of our deliberations a mechanism. And if there is a mechanism, as Freud says, as Marx says, as Nietzsche says, there are these mechanisms behind our charitableness, behind our economic prosperity, behind our sense of identity, etc. There are these strange mechanisms formed behind our backs that are sort of running us like marionettes. Then surely it would be more rational to turn directly to the mechanism and try and redesign it. Why carry on in a kind of theatre when we can go backstage and fool with the works? So I don't see a conciliation. I don't see the one steering the other. I don't think they provide capacity to each other. I think they're in a state of head-on collision. And I think, it's interesting that the philosophers take a kind of leery interest in us because they know we are their assassins. I mean, just briefly, take a pivotal figure who both they and you regard as important. Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is somebody who through the 1960s and the 70s, writes a series of studies of really morality. How do we come to see ourselves as both acting, valuing, and rational? during a certain time in European history, the 17th century, up to now. How do we come to have that conception of ourselves? And he says something like what Kant says. He's a very big Kantian. He says, we come to think of ourselves, we come to submit ourselves to norms, and we come to submit ourselves to justifications based on norms. We create a kind of judgment. But he then goes on in the next breath to spell out in detail absolutely architectural configurations in which these norms arise for the first time and become possible. The leprosarium, an isolated building, turns into an observational space in which the norms of mad and sane start to emerge, and with that medical psychiatry. The epidemiological grid of the plague village, where you have people confined and patrolled, whatever, and documented, gets internalized into the hospital ward with the case file and the ability to track and bureaucratize the path of illness. Right? That's a piece of architecture. That is a spatial machine. It is, in the social engineering terms, an environment. In his great masterpiece, The Order of Things, he says the innocent activity of natural history and trying to classify flowers and animals and fossils and whatever, and languages and so on and so forth in the 17th and 18th century, then folds inside out to create this mysterious, problematic figure of man. And our problem then becomes, how do we reintegrate man into nature, having first made man like an origami form out of our concept of nature. That is a very architectural, very spatial, very brilliant conception, but it is an environment. It's an environment in which something happens. Right? It's a topology. And then, of course, discipline and punish, how a modern concept of normative rationality itself develops coextensively with the prison. And the prison is a kind of architecture. In the days of Roger, every second word at conferences was panopticon. And yet it was a philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, who proposed the panopticon as a space in which to enact normative rationality. So there is an uncanny incest between these two notions, but they really fly apart. At the point at which it becomes possible in the 20th century to wage war through control of the environment, at the point at which it becomes more efficient to throw a cloud of poison gas over the enemy trenches than to sit there for months shooting the enemy one-on-one with a rifle. At that point, you are using an environment to eliminate your enemy. And you are creating a piece of pure modern design in the gas mask to be able to go into that environment and allow it to be hospitable to you. The World War I is an environment versus environment war. The point at which destruction of the environment becomes possible is the emancipation of design as the most important social and political force, because the two correlate upon one another. There is something of this motif that runs constantly through Virilio, when he says war is the accelerator, through Friedrich Kittler, when he says that war is the accelerator of media changes, and media are our most intimate environment. Something of this certainly runs through Schlotterbeck in his study of environments, which he calls spheres. And he says, it's a book Heidegger should have written, Being in Space, as a sequel to Being in Time. These ideas percolate together, but they really are perfectly compatible. So in one figure, like Foucault, you have to talk about this, I must talk about that. And the net result of Foucault's work is to say environments are oppressive. The whole power knowledge notion, they produce us in a certain way behind our backs. What sort of politics do we need to get rid of that situation? So these are the things which float through, and because architecture is being prepared to entertain in its theoretical spaces, in its reflection and so on, all these counter-philosophical notions of normative rationality, results being achieved in a very blind way by smart environments, by in fact a revolution of design. we've almost been like the mote in the eye of the philosophers. So it's not particularly surprising that they don't really have much to say to us. They don't want to catch our disease. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask what you think the relationship between a philosopher and philosophy is, and an architect is to architecture, in that architecture seems to be shaped by things, or determined by things, or commissioned by forces before it gets to the architect. And you can articulate that box in some way, but a limited way. I don't think architecture really shapes that box, sort of where we are, that there are environmental forces before it gets there. And I'd like to know what the role of the architect in shaping that box is, and what role we actually play, because I don't think we do actually shape that entire environment. Maybe theoretically, but not practically. So how do we answer to what we are contingent to, or are we autonomous? I just want to know what that relationship is, because I think we're contaminated. Well, in a sense, we aren't as powerful as the model suggests. Maybe it's money.
I think we're more powerful than the model suggests. Not in an obvious way, and I appreciate your question. I think it's a very good question. I think most of what you're saying is absolutely true. However, I think that certainly Western administrations have, through centuries of normative rationality, which you all know what that is now tonight. You can tell your grandchildren, hey, normative rationality, that's that guy Kant. Through centuries of normative rationality, administrations can't simply say we're managements. Politicians would love to say we're managements, we're social engineers, but they are obliged to give reasons. They are obliged to be called to justify to one another, to constituencies, to the opposition, to themselves. Now, as long as we are in the habit of believing that being able to justify is important, and that the difference between sheer manipulation and politics is that politicians can justify, and they justify in a public way which is open to our game of give further justification, answer questions. How do you defend? As long as we believe that, we, or society, 90% of which socially engineers its way around problems by shaping and reshaping environments, also feels the need to justify social engineering. When you're Stalin, or when you're Hitler, when you can oppress people and impose something on them, and you've completely abrogated their rights, you don't have to justify. But when, as in South Africa in the last 20 years, you have to also operate within a context of rights, hence you have to do something, but everything you do requires justification. Those things which are done infrastructurally, design-wise, urbanistically, housingly, everything within our orbit, say, also requires justification. Now I can assure you that civil engineers are not lying awake thinking about their justification essay. You are lying awake thinking about what idiotic demand I'm placing on you in a theory course to give justification, because the perspectives I'm giving you tonight and in RFS 740 are in fact the instruments of justification for what is essentially a design intervention, a creation of environments. The architect is the only person who concerns themselves and takes it upon themselves to study these processes and to act and intervene in these processes in such a way that is accountable. And that can be provided with a justification, which is not to say that the architect today explains the process by saying, I'm a rational being and I did that, because then you're quite correct. It would take a lot of autonomy for that to be convincing, and architects don't have a lot of autonomy. But the architect says today, as an architect, architect, through bitter experience of being disintermediated, nevertheless believe that what separates my discipline from the creation of hamster cages for humans is the possibility of justification. Therefore, I have the following theories, which might not serve as justifications in the classic sense, but they serve as explanations. And so each of you comes with several genealogies of the environment, which function as theory philosophically, and in fact as explanations. So you are the reason givers, even if the reasons aren't all that pleasant. You might say this is because of capitalism, this is because of exploitation, you might give a Lefebvre type reason, you might give a this or that, but you're in fact giving a justification in the form of an explanation. Even you saying it is a runaway process is giving an explanation by way of justifying your role in it. Do you see what I mean? So only the architects concern themselves with kind of winkling into this space and understanding it from the profile, or the perspective, if you like, of its justification and its explanation. In other words, theoretically. So it is theory alone, and the theoretical concern to justify and explain, that lets you hang in to these processes with something that the other participants in the value chain don't have, but which all the initiators of the process, the politicians, the money bags, the developers, the dictators, the whatever, the occupational armies, whoever's the mover and shaker of the built environment at the time, have to give. So you are their important person. You might be the least powerful person in practice, but you're the most significant person in terms of the whole civic, political, economic process that shapes that, because you alone provide justification, because you alone, out of I don't know what reason really, concern yourself, you remain determined through history, through aesthetics, through various very mixed means to justify what happens in this domain. If it's a Bauhaus justifying it on scientific principles, it still is a justificatory activity. And that distinguishes architects from everyone else. And that is what you should build on. That is what I think the dignity and the integrity of the discipline consists of. You have to be among the first people to follow this precipitous plunge, if you like, into social engineering, into the primacy of environments, and still insist that they can be explained. Like going to Mars at high speed, and you're still giving an account like a reporter of these microphones of the trip. You may not be in control, but you are still providing justification. And justification is the one thing that allows built environmental design processes to have legitimacy in modern societies. So you might be a nothing in the project, but you're the most talked about person when it comes to selling the project to the constituency. That's why when architects go to see public works, they actually sit up and listen, because it talks to the whole civic mode of justification, of reason giving. Whereas engineers go there, they say, how much money do these guys want this time? So you're in an interesting tactical position, which hopefully we can sort of work out and capacitate. So it makes you a bit odd in the School of Engineers. It makes you a suspicious shadow in the School of Philosophers. You are very effective philosophers while you have the pencil in your hand. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming on.
Jean-Pierre, thanks very much indeed. Students have the pleasures of follow-on classes for discussion. So, I believe you had your first lecture today. Yeah. So, and are all you in Jean-Pierre class or not? No.
It's on the
floor. We have the pleasure of in the future. But thanks very much indeed for your time. And
thank you very much for the invitation.
And I think next in fortnight's time. 1st of October. Unfortunately, I can't be here, but we will have our next discussion. And hopefully encourage your colleagues to come along and some of your senior colleagues. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.